Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to the committee print offered by Mr. Biggs of Arizona, page 6, strike lines 7 through 15.
Mr. Biggs, you are recognized for 5 minutes to explain your amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So we're striking lines 7 through 15. These are the waiver provisions dealing with the amnesty section, not dealing with the other PRA adjustments. We're dealing with the amnesty provisions of Section 245B. And here's the thing to understand, that this is not a reconciliation bill. This is the amnesty bill. This is adjustments. So what's interesting about it, we talked last time about the rationale, the thing, how broad the discretion is in the secretary. But let's talk about the crimes that you can have waived as your inadmissibility. So for instance, under 2C of Section 212A, if you look at 2C, that's included. You can get that waived. That's for drug trafficking. That's for controlled substances, trafficking in controlled substances. How about 212A2E? That's for serious crimes. Serious crimes. They can waive that. Homeland Secretary can waive that cause for inadmissibility. How about H? Subsection H. That is for significant trafficking of persons. The Homeland Secretary can waive that as an admissibility criterion. How about even money laundering? Yeah, all those could be waived as a condition of inadmissibility. But that's not the worst of it in actuality. If you look at 6E of Section 212, what you're going to see is that's for smuggling, again, human smuggling. Now, the least onerous, perhaps, is violating your student visa. We got a lot of people who overstay their visa. That's 6G. But you can also have unlawful voting. Well, that's one of those voting integrity issues. That's 10D, Section 212, 10D. So there are so many very serious crimes that the Homeland Secretary could waive. For what reasons? Oh, humanitarian purposes, or family unity, or just whatever the Secretary says, oh, that's public interest. These are very serious crimes that the Homeland Secretary can waive in order to grant amnesty under the language of this bill. That's the language of this bill, this section. And I assume that you put this in here because you intend to have these things waived.
I sent you a couple of emails over. Let me know if you got them, okay? Thank you.
Well, what, I don't know.
Lou Correa, you need to mute.
Yeah, members will mute there, please.
Yeah. So if you don't intend, why did you specifically exclude paragraph 2, which has all those drug traffickers, serious crimes, significant trafficking of persons, money laundering, very serious crimes? Why did you include those in wavering, in the waiver provision here for the amnesty provision? 6E, again, smuggling of human beings. Aiding and abetting people coming into the country. Guess what? You know what? The cartels, for the last 2.5 years, every time I've gone to the border and talked to Border Patrol agents, the intelligence folks, ICE agents, they'll tell me the cartel controls those who are coming across. The human smuggling, the human trafficking, 212.6E. Guess what? You aid and abet somebody coming across, you're going to get potentially have that grounds for inadmissibility waived by the Homeland Secretary.
Will the gentleman yield?
Yes, I'll yield to the gentleman from North Carolina.
To the gentleman from Arizona's point, and I guess this is going to be a bit repetitious, but I'm sort of flummoxed. So the majority is proposing to put in language to permit the Secretary, notwithstanding the general provisions, to waive these restrictions. In other words, if you are a human trafficker The majority wants the secretary to be able to waive that and let you enter the United States. I guess it's because of the money. They want the money. I yield back to the gentleman.
Thank you. It's hard to understand why you would allow people who are trafficking controlled substances, trafficking human beings, to remain admissible or eligible for admissibility into our country. I urge the passage of my amendment. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I'll yield to the gentlelady from California in opposition to the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I do oppose the amendment. First, let me say that
Gentlelady, yield I withdraw my point of order.
point of order is withdrawn. The language, the waiver language, as well as the expunged conviction language, was taken from the bill that Senator Graham and Senator Durbin wrote together. And we thought it had some sense, but let's keep in mind that it is discretionary and also limited by section, by the three offenses language. I'll just give you a couple of examples of why something sounds so serious, but there can be exceptions. And one is a private bill that we unanimously, as an immigration subcommittee, agreed to ask for a report on. And that had to do with unlawful voting. Well, obviously, we are all opposed to people who are not U.S. citizens from voting. That's wrong, and it's a bar to getting a visa in the United States, as it should be. However, and here's what happened. The bill was introduced by our colleague, the representative from Alaska, Mr. Young, and it had to do with a woman, Rebecca Trimble, a mother of two who's married to an Army dentist in Alaska. She was adopted, and she believed her whole life that her parents believed that she was a U.S. citizen when they adopted her. She cast her ballot when she was 18, excited to do that, and she didn't find out till she was way later that her parents didn't file the paperwork they needed to file. She voted illegally, which she thought she was a citizen, and there's no waiver, and so she's going to be deported, and her Army husband and her American citizen children for something that she didn't even know. I think we can see that there are times where that makes sense. In fact, our subcommittee said that doesn't make sense.
Would the gentlelady yield?
Not when I'm finished. I'll see if there's time left. Smuggling, we are all opposed to, but let me give you a case I happen to know from years ago of an individual, I'll call him Joe, who was a legal resident of the United States and went down to Tijuana for his birthday, and with his wife, who was undocumented. They drank heavily, he did, in celebration of his birthday, and because he did not want to drive drunk, he had his wife drive his truck back over the border with him as a passenger. He was charged with smuggling his wife into the United States, and technically, he was probably correct. But he did actually manage to get some discretion in that case. The only point I'm making is that there are instances where the blind application of the law may not actually fit with the facts, which is why I'm sure that Senator Graham and Senator Durbin included this waiver provision in their language, and frankly, we just cribbed it. It is important to note that the waiver, as I mentioned earlier, does not relate to line 3 through 24 on page 5. So there is that protection from the various litany of horrible opportunities that could occur. Let's say why rehabilitation and redemption matters in America. If you did something that was illegal, but you didn't even know it, for example, the beneficiary of Congressman Young's constituent, that young mother who believed she was a citizen and thought when she went to vote for Congressman Young that she was doing the right thing. If she, that has to be without regard, without possibility of excuse. She has to leave forever and leave her Army husband and her children. That can't be. That's why we have the possibility of redemption, of waiver, to have some sense that can be implied when the circumstances require it. I want to get back just briefly to, I think my time is over, but let's get back to the economic benefit. Let's get this matter voted so that we can advance it to the floor for the economic benefit of our country. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does Mr. Bishop seek recognition?
Move to strike last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I don't want to impose on anyone's patience too long about getting to the economic benefits, getting to the money. But I cannot, following up on the gentlelady from California's comments just now, I think it's worth focusing on one part of this. The waiver language would permit the waiver of any part of paragraph 2 of section 212A on conditions of admissibility. And one of those subparts is H, significant traffickers in persons. Any alien who commits or conspires to commit human trafficking offenses in the United States or outside the United States, who the consular officer or the Secretary of State or et cetera knows or has reason to believe is or has been a knowing of aider, abettor, assister, conspirator, or colluder with such a trafficker in severe forms of trafficking in persons as defined in section 103 of such act. I'm led to wonder about if anyone could either hypothesize or report some fairly innocent person who needs an opportunity for redemption and therefore needs a waiver from the Secretary when they have been a trafficker in severe forms of trafficking in persons. How could someone cornering the market on human trafficking be someone we should make sure there's a preservation of an opportunity for waiver of their inadmissibility from permanent legal residence? It's unimaginable to me. And I yield to Mr. Biggs.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. And, I understand there's an attempt to really say, well, there's some limitations there on the waiver. Yeah, well, we're not talking about page 5. We're talking about page 6 here. And those same conditions are gone. Those same conditions are gone on page 6 of this bill. They don't deal with the waiver section that you have here. I appreciate what the gentleman from North Carolina read because I wanted to cover that as well, but he's exactly right when you start talking about the actual language. How about this, smugglers? So by the way, the condition where the guy is helping his wife or whatever who's illegally in the country, helping him there, well, under 6E, which has an exemption here, the waiver can exist. There actually is a special rule in the case of family reunification clause. That's already in there, the protection for what you want. But here we go. Any alien who at any time knowingly has encouraged, induced, assisted, abetted, or aided any other alien to enter or try to enter the United States in violation of law is inadmissible. So you got 2H, which Mr. Bishop just read, you got 6G, which I just read, and what you're basically saying is, what we know to be true, that the logistics arm of the cartels is the U.S. government, and the private individuals who are aiding and abetting them or assisting them And you're saying, well, you know what? If there's some kind of humanitarian person, how about family unity? You know, they helped all these other people come into the country illegally, but doggone it, they have a spouse who's in North Dakota. We want them to be united, so we want to waive the inadmissibility condition that they have. Yeah. So what do you do there? What do you do? Is the reality is this waiver provision is so broad that this secretary, this administration, who we don't have trust in, is basically going to grant willy-nilly these waivers because a waiver otherwise in the public interest, that's up to the secretary. That's not up to us. You've basically ceded over your legislative authority right to the Homeland Secretary. And I'll yield back to the gentleman from North Carolina.
I think the final point that I would make, subject to anyone else seeking the time, is the point was made earlier that this language was in a provision in the bill as drafted in the Senate. Well, it might be worth saying that the bill was defeated in the House for a reason. And I don't believe there's any reason for us slavishly to follow it now. And I yield to Mr. Benz.
Thank you for the time. It won't take long for me to point out that this waiver provision is a reflection of what we see in the entire approach to immigration, which is to say, yes, we have the law, but we're going to ignore it. Yes, you broke the law, but we're going to ignore it. Yes, it's bad, but we'll ignore it. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purposes Mr. McClintock seek recognition?
To speak on the amendment.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, a number of points scream at us from this mass amnesty that the Democrats are setting in motion today. First is the sheer size of it. The estimates between 8 and 10 million foreign nationals who broke our nation's laws and now demand to stay here will be given legal permanent residency and an expedited path to citizenship. Now, I think it's important that we understand what this population is. Let's take the low figure, 8 million. That is the population of every man, woman, and child in the states of Wyoming, Vermont, Alaska, North Dakota, South Dakota, Delaware, Rhode Island, Montana, and Maine combined. Another is the expense. According to the Center for Immigration Studies, it will cost our Social Security and Medicare funds over $1 trillion at a time when they are already approaching insolvency. Another is the lax requirements to qualify. As we've been discussing, even if you have 2 misdemeanor convictions, that's okay. If you're 18 and came in December, all you need to do is enroll in a community college course, volunteer at an internship somewhere, and congratulations, you're in. And how do you document your claim? Well, the measure is silent on this point. Conceivably, you could do it by affidavit. In other words, you have a friend vouch for you. And if you can't even meet these loose requirements, well, the grounds for inadmissibility, as we've been discussing, the Secretary of Homeland Security can waive a wide variety of them anyway, for humanitarian reasons, family unity, or public interest. What does that mean? It means anything he wants it to mean. The law is now in the Secretary's mouth, and he can pick and choose who must obey the law and who's above the law. The amendment simply says no one's above the law, that the requirements, as lax as they are, can't be swept aside when they prove inconvenient. Finally, we keep hearing about the importance of giving second chances. Of course, the operative word there is chance. In other words, risk. Well, here's a modest suggestion. For those who broke our border laws to come here, broke our immigration laws to stay here, broke our employment laws to take jobs here, and then committed other crimes against Americans while here. Perhaps your own countrymen should take that chance on you. We've got our hands more than full taking second, third, and fourth chances with our own citizens.
Will the gentleman yield? Good job, Tom. Great job.
Gentleman yields back. For For what purposes, Mr. Jordan seek recognition?
Last word, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's recognized.
Number one concern I hear from the constituents, I get the privilege of representing folks in the 4th District of Ohio, frankly, from people around our state, around the country, is concern about the election process, about the integrity of our election process. I hear that, I get this question, I get this concern all the time. Understand what's happening in this legislation that the Democrats want to pass. And the gentleman from Arizona brought this up in his comment on his amendment. Page 6, line 7, waiver. With respect to any benefit under this section, the Secretary of Homeland Security may waive the grounds for inadmissibility under paragraph 10D of section 212A. 10D of section 212A says unlawful voters. So right now you cannot waive the inadmissibility. If someone engages in unlawful voting, that cannot be waived, but this bill is going to change that. Say if you cheated in the election process, if you were involved in unlawful voting, that we can waive that. We can waive that. That to me is frightening. And I understand the scenario that the gentlelady from California brought up, but we can deal with that in a private bill. In fact, that's what I believe Representative Young has done, introduced a private bill. And there's a big difference between unknowingly engaging in unlawful voting, as you described with this lady in Alaska, and knowingly engaging in election fraud. But your legislation makes no distinction between those two. It says if you engage in election fraud, the Secretary of Homeland Security can waive that, and you're on your path to citizenship here in the United States. Potentially for all kinds of people. I mean, again, in light of what I hear from constituents, what I hear from Americans all over the country, that's what the Democrats are doing in this legislation. That is just dead wrong. In a bill, as has been said now, I don't know how many times, that gives amnesty to between 8 and 10 million Americans. If you cheated and voted, no problem. That's what this bill also says. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who else seeks recognition? In that case, the question occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. No. The noes appear to have it.
Mr. Chairman, I request.
Roll call vote is requested.
Thank you.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Nadler?
No.
Mr. Nadler votes no. Ms. Lofgren? Ms. Lofgren votes no. Ms. Jackson-Lee?
No.
Ms. Jackson-Lee votes no. Mr. Cohen?
No.
Mr. Cohen votes no. Mr. Johnson of Georgia?
No.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes no. Mr. Deutsch? Ms. Bass?
No.
Ms. Bass votes no. Mr. Jeffries? Mr. Cicilline? Mr. Cicilline votes no. Mr. Swalwell?
No.
Mr. Swalwell votes no. Mr. Liu?
Lou votes no.
Mr. Liu votes no. Mr. Raskin?
Raskin votes no.
Mr. Raskin votes no. Ms. Jayapal?
No.
Ms. Jayapal votes no. Ms. Dimmings?
No.
Ms. Dimmings votes no. Mr. Correa?
No.
Mr. Correa votes no. Ms. Scanlon? Ms. Scanlon votes no. Ms. Garcia?
No.
Ms. Garcia votes no. Mr. Neguse?
No.
Mr. Neguse votes no. Ms. McBath?
No.
Ms. McBath votes no. Mr. Stanton?
No.
Mr. Stanton votes no. Ms. Dean?
No.
Ms. Dean votes no. Ms. Escobar? Ms. Escobar?
No.
Ms. Escobar votes no. Mr. Jones?
No.
Mr. Jones votes no. Ms. Ross?
Ross votes no.
Ms. Ross votes no. Ms. Bush?
Bush votes no.
Ms. Bush votes no. Mr. Jordan? Mr. Jordan votes yes. Mr. Shabbat?
Aye.
Mr. Shabbat votes aye. Mr. Gomert?
Aye.
Mr. Gomert votes aye. Mr. Issa? Mr. Issa votes aye. Mr. Buck? Mr. Gates.
Aye.
Mr. Gates votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes aye. Mr. Biggs. Mr. Biggs votes aye. Mr. McClintock.
Aye.
Mr. McClintock votes aye. Mr. Stube.
Yes.
Mr. Stube votes yes. Mr. Tiffany.
Aye.
Mr. Tiffany votes aye. Mr. Massey.
On committee. Aye.
Mr. Massey votes aye. Mr. Roy.
Aye.
Mr. Roy votes aye. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop votes aye. Ms. Fishbach.
Aye.
Ms. Fishbach votes aye. Ms. Sparts.
Sparks, yes.
Ms. Sparts votes yes. Mr. Fitzgerald.
Aye.
Mr. Fitzgerald votes aye. Mr. Benz.
Yes.
Mr. Benz votes yes. Mr. Owens.
Aye.
Mr. Owens votes aye.
Mr. Chairman, how am I recorded?
Mr. Jeffries, you are not recorded.
Jeffries votes no.
Mr. Jeffries votes no.
Mr. Chairman, how am I recorded?
Mr. Deutsch, you are not recorded.
No.
Mr. Deutsch votes no.
Mr. Chairman, how am I recorded?
Mr. Buck, you are not recorded.
I vote aye.
Mr. Buck votes aye.
Are there any other members who wish to be recorded who haven't been recorded? Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 19 ayes and 25 noes.
The amendment is not agreed to. Are there any further amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute?
Mr. Chairman,
For what purpose does Mr. Biggs seek
an
recognition?
amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
I reserve a point